recording on that note here. So looking at homework, not everyone has turned it in. That's okay. It's that point in the semester where some things get pushed. I understand the analogy of like dropping balls or juggling balls, and the best response I ever heard to that was, you got to figure out which balls are glass and which ones are rubber. And if my homework was rubber, fine. I hope you caught all the glass. So I can't go over the whole thing with folks live because that would spoil the fun for the people who have not done it yet. But if you're looking at your answers and thinking, I don't know why that's wrong, send me a note or ask me a question, because it's possible that my answer key is wrong. I am human, I make mistakes. So I'm happy to clarify why something is the way it is, or to double check my own work to make sure that the coding system is accurate. But homework 3, I updated grades this morning. Those who completed it, for the most part, did pretty well. Hopefully you can look through your pattern of mistakes, if you made any, and see where things went awry. And we did have a couple perfect scores, which means that I'm hopeful the answer key is correct, but if not, then we'll see. Question?
So I don't know if you can do this, but for question 39 in section 1.
Okay. 39 in section 1. Oh, the results questions.
Yeah.
There it is.
The second one.
Yep.
So of those, was there an answer that maybe like should have been obviously incorrect?
This one I think is relatively straightforward because it's based on the idea of intra-class correlation. So we can review that for a second if you'd like. Intra-class correlation ranges between 0 and 1, right?
Yeah.
So a 0 means that you have no between cluster variation. A 1 means that you have all between cluster and no within. And something in the middle means you've got some of both, to at least some extent. And the idea is that if a predictor has between cluster variation, it could have a between cluster slope predicting something else. If it has within cluster variation, it could have a within cluster slope predicting something else. So the type of variance a predictor has is a prerequisite for what it can or can't do in a model.
All right, just ignore me while I...
This stuff is hard. You should not feel bad that you're not doing it perfectly yet. Seriously. I'm like 20 years into this, and I'm still figuring out stuff that I did wrong or didn't understand as well as I should have. I'm going through this class materials relative to the version I taught 4 years ago, and it's almost a complete teardown because I had some stuff wrong. I didn't understand smushed random slopes like I do now. I didn't understand cross-classified contextual nope, I'm out of words. Cross-classified contextual effects. That's hard. That's not just me. So don't feel bad that you don't understand everything perfectly on the first try. That's not the goal. The goal is to get you further along in this journey than you were when you walked in the door, and every single one of you can say that you're on the journey with me, right? Yes. Ding, ding. All right. We turn on closed captioning. Yes, I will do that. Okay. So homework 3 is over. The next thing you have to do is homework 4. You get to that spot. Yep. 2 weeks. Homework 4. Either you're analyzing your own data using this rubric for what should be included, or you're helping ChatGPT get better at answering questions indirectly, or learning why our jobs are safe, even though there's ChatGPT. What you can be doing also in the meantime is your next formative assessment, number 5. I opened that up this morning, so you should be able to answer the first 2 questions right now. The last question, hopefully, either today or for sure Thursday, as we transition into the next unit, which is generalized models. So we'll see how far into that we get today. If we don't start it today, then so what? I'd rather make sure that we cover things well and have fewer topics than to try and not do a good job on some things to get to others. So that's my plan. So any questions about homework, logistics, schedule, stuff like that? No? Look, it's almost Thanksgiving. I can see it on the calendar. We get a whole week off of no office hours, no classes, and hopefully you all can do some fun things or visit your family or both. Well, recognizing that those may not be synonyms for everyone. So.
I was going to say is, so things are due and nothing is going to be open
yes.
during that time?
Yeah, so No, nothing due the Monday of that week because it's not a class day, and nothing due the Monday after because I'm not insane. How about that? That's just mean to make something due the Monday after Thanksgiving when you haven't had access to anyone or, the material in a while. But yeah, then after that, one more formative assessment and your last homework will be due at the end of finals week. That I will have up well in advance. I aim to have that out by Thanksgiving. That way you can work on it whenever your schedule permits. Because I know that this is like final project season, and so if you want to knock that out before you're worried about your projects, that's fine. Okay. So yeah, on the downhill stretch here, folks. Good in there. How about we talk about some cross-classified models? So, excellent. Yeah. So we started looking at this example last time. Should we review or re-go over any of it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that a vote for review or re-go over? Because those are not the same. Those are levels.
Why don't we start with review?
Start with review.
And then potentially re-go over.
Fair.
But I am one man.
You are.
Don't let me speak for.
Zoomers, do you want to have a vote? Review or re-go over? Or start with review and then transition as needed?
Review's fine with me.
Okay. We reserve the right to re-go over. Okay, so we're starting with review and then we'll see what's needed. So the story for this assignment is children nested in the primary school they went to, so like their elementary, junior high. In this system, they're lumping those together, it sounds like. And they're also simultaneously nested in the secondary school that they now go to. So this is achievement in 9th grade, like when they start secondary school. So you would think that their achievement might have something to do with the characteristics of the school they used to go to. So it matters not only where you are currently, but where you've been is the idea. This is a cross-sectional example, though, so we're not dealing with changes in clustering over time per se. It's just the history of each participant as a source of additional clustering. And since not all the kids who went to the same primary school go to the same secondary school and vice versa, these are crossed at level 2. So we're still in 2-level model land, but the difference is that there is more than one kind of level 2 unit, and thus more than one kind of level 2 random effect that's going to be needed. That's the big picture. So I did a bunch of data manipulation stuff. Those of you working on individual data analyses will find this useful for your descriptive statistics. One of the things I'm asking for is level-specific means, variances, correlations, and stuff like that. So we did all that, did all that, did all that. And when it comes to level 1 predictors, I have a unique version of the level 1 predictor that I created that renders it orthogonal to both the primary school and the secondary school by centering it at the mean for each unique combination. So just remember, in this data set, we have an additional complexity that there are up to 6 individual children nested within each unique combination of primary crossed with secondary. That means that we have the potential to isolate what looks like an interaction random effect beyond just the standard type of random effect. Now I'm making sure I'm recording. Yes, I am. Okay, good. So we'll get to that in just a bit. And here's the corresponding R code using the unique function to build the unique data sets and using the add unit means function to build cluster means to add to the data set. And I'm sure there's other ways to do it. If you have R code that does this differently and it still works, Godspeed, do it your way. I just want to give you at least something to start with so that if you don't have to ask the Google. I have found that asking the Google how to do things in R is very challenging because there's 8 million different people who know how to do things in R, and I can never get any of their suggestions to work, it seems like. So it's non-trivial, but I figured that they pay me. That's my job to figure that out, and so here's some code that works. So first step, empty model. I'm in composite notation, as I call it, because having multiple level 2 types of units means multiple level 2 equations gets ugly real quick, so I'm not going to do it. So today's subscripts are CPS. Once again, that does not stand for Child Protective Services. That stands for child within primary, within secondary. So that's why I have 3 zeros on my gamma term, because it is the intercept of the intercept of the intercepts. I have a random intercept across primary schools, so I put the P in the middle where it goes, and I have a level 1 residual for each child within their combination. So my standard 2-level model starts with check the -2 log likelihood value so that we can make sure we have that to compare against future models. Interclass correlation for this is 0.233. So this analysis says secondary school doesn't matter, but children who went to the same primary school are correlated on average 0.23. Or 23% of the variance in this outcome has to do with your primary school. And that means that both child level predictors and primary school level predictors are going to be relevant here because it has variance of both kinds. And that 0.23 is significantly greater than 0 via the likelihood ratio test against a model that doesn't have any random intercepts, which I did not estimate because the Renova function in R will do it for you. Renova just drops out all the random effects one at a time, so you just look at the line for the one that you intended. In Stata, there is a likelihood ratio test for no random effects printed as default part of the output underneath the solution for fixed effects. Okay, then in yellow, the new part, adding the crossing. So we want to test whether or not there is an additional source of dependency in these outcomes due to which secondary school each child currently attends. So I'm adding a second random intercept at level 2. So this is the crossed dimension. It is unrelated. So these two they live in separate worlds. They do not have any covariances because they're separate things. So to do that in Stata requires some under the hood manipulation that you don't have to do, but it's reflected in the specification of the code. So the cross dimension that has fewer units to it, you would do this too, this bar for a different random dimension, underscore all colon, and then r dot in front of the nesting variable. It will run if you do it this way, but not as well. So I've tried multiple permutations of this. I finally got it right thanks to Don Hedeker, thank you very much, and his explanation of it is what I would refer you to. The Stata manual also tries to explain what the hell this means to varying levels of transparency. So now we have a new level 2 random intercept variance in addition to the old one. Looks to be relatively smaller than the two. These are on the same scale, so I can make that comparison. To determine whether or not we need it, likelihood ratio test. So general principle, if you have a question about random anything, that's a likelihood ratio test. Anything you do to your model for the variance is a likelihood ratio test, holding the fixed effects constant. So in this model, there's only a fixed intercept, so we don't have to worry about that. In R, the code is more straightforward. We just get another set of parentheses here. So 1 for the intercept for S school ID, which is secondary school. And our friend Renova gives a likelihood ratio test for us. So then trying to explain what this is a little bit tricky. And if you have to do this in a real paper, I would take the time to do it because your reader will thank you. These 3 variance components are all orthogonal. That means I can sum them and talk about the proportion due to each. So I did that in SAS to put all the numbers in one table. So that total is the sum of these 3. Then I computed the proportion relative to this total. So the math is down here. So in this model, the correlation of students from the same primary school is about what it was in the previous, 0.23. That's not a coincidence. I'll spare you the coincidence for consequence discussion. Not a coincidence, because where the new random intercept variance came from for the crossing is out of the residual. So everything gets pulled out of residual when you add a new variance component. So there's less residual variance now than there was before because it went over here. So 23% of the total variation in achievement has to do with what primary school they went to, 10% has to do with what secondary school, and the rest is which kid it is. So kids are relatively more different from each other even after you control for what school they went to. How that translates into ICCs, for these two is direct. These are intraclass correlations. So the only catch is that they're in isolation relative to the unique combination. So I did that in R to show you the numbers. So 0.23 is the intraclass correlation of students who went to the same primary school but different secondary schools. 0.10 is the ICC for the same secondary but different primary. And then to get to what would it be if they shared both schools, you add them together. So these two added together works out to be the 3-3 that you see on the screen, and that means the expected correlation of students who have both in common. We're assuming an additive relationship in this model. Go for it.
So, and it's fine to point me back to something else if we've covered this, but when you're running the var core model function, how do you know which numbers you need to put in the brackets?
That's a great question. So varchar is extracting some of the results, and as data frame saves it as something that looks more like a data set. So this is what this is.
Okay.
And so then the first number is row, the second number is column.
Okay.
So 1, 4 is like, here's row 1, 2, 3, here's the fourth column.
Okay.
So that's that number plus that number plus that number is the total.
Okay.
And then I just, since I don't have to type it as much, then I just abbreviate total here, so it's already contained. That's how. But had I not seen this table, I'd have no idea how to answer that question. Yes, and no, I had not talked about that before, so thank you for asking. I learned by doing this math what was actually happening when I requested ICCs. The one that shows up by default in these models is the one that adds them together. And to get to what it would be separate, you have to do by group for cross models. I don't know how this extends to other types of designs, but as long as you can get into the solution and figure out the math, then you can work backwards to figure out what the command must have been doing. Last but not least, we know that both sources of variance are significant. There are differences across each type of school. Confidence intervals can help us to describe the extent of those differences in relative terms. So for primary schools, here's the expected range of 95% of them in their school means. Here's the expected range for secondary. Note that it's a little bit narrower, which is not a coincidence because there's less of an interclass correlation for secondary. So there's less variance across clusters. So this is a level 2 confidence interval across primary. This is also a level 2 confidence interval across secondary that describes the extent of the variation. Okay, how are we doing? So then because I have a unique person, more than one unique person in each unique combination, I could actually fit the random interaction term. So I created a new ID variable that would keep track of unique combinations, and I fit that in the model as well. That turned out to be not significant, so we're not going to keep it. That's possible only because I have more than one child per combination for at least 40% of the kids. And if I were to keep it, though, that unique combination would add to the interclass correlation for the two. So it adds an extra correlation between kids in the same place that's not already identified by the separate correlations of secondary and primary. All right.
And sorry, just to clarify, that 36% is like all of the level 2 reasons why students differ.
Yeah, so it's, according to this model, this is the extra piece that was added by the interaction, and that's not significant. Meaning the 34% we had before and the 36 we have now are not different. So there's nothing extra that's like some special combination of these kids that shared both. Just, it looks to be additive. Okay, then we get to SES, which is our student level predictor. I'm going to fit the same two-way crossed plus random interaction model on that. And what I ended up back is a whole bunch of zeros. So this tells me that when UPOC simulated these data, he simulated them to not have any school level variance in SES, which is consistent with how he modeled them in his book to not have contextual effects. So I guess if you know that there's no cluster variance, then it's cool to not worry about smushing. However, there is a little bit of interaction variance because this is also a child thing, because there's so many school combinations that only have one kid in them. So these are kind of confounded. But what this is telling me is that functionally speaking, there's not cluster variance in SES. I'm going to pretend like there is because in real life, we don't necessarily know how the data were simulated. But it looks like most of the information is at level 1. Then we get predictors. So I've added 3 fixed effects in one fell swoop. I've got whether the primary school was denominational, which I think means religious, secondary school, and then the interaction of the two. And of course, my computer wants to restart itself while I teach yet again. Please stop doing that. I asked nicely. I could start swearing, but I don't feel like that's effective. So here's my 3 new fixed effects in SAS and in Stata. It looks like not a one of them matters, but we can practice interaction terms. So if I asked you, like in a homework, what's the simple slope of primary denomination for a secondary school that's not denominational? Is that in here, or do I have to add something to get it? What's the effect of primary school if secondary school is 0?
The coefficient we have there, that 0.07.
Yeah, that's that one, because this would drop out if secondary is 0. So homework question I answered several times, how do I get this effect if this is 1 instead? Like for treatment B instead of treatment A.
Adding the interaction.
You got to add them together. So it would be this slope plus whatever value of the moderator you're trying to get the slope for. So if you want to turn this to 1, then it's that number plus that number. Likewise, this is the slope of secondary when primary is 0. If I want to get to what the slope for secondary is when primary is 1, it's that number plus that number. And given that these are all positive numbers, the pattern of both interaction moderation is a more positive. So this interaction slope is taking each of these stronger, more positive, but none of them is significant. So then my question was, I think this is maybe where we left off or thereabouts, which is responsible for which pile of variance? Get them on the same screen there. So the first term here, this is from SAS, primary school differences was about 1.5% of that were explained by what? Which of these 3?
The first one.
Yeah, primary to primary. How about differences between secondary schools?
Second one.
Second one. And the residual
First interaction.
had to have been that one. Because this is still, the unique primary by secondary is still buried in the residual because we tested it and decided to leave it back in because it wasn't significant as a random interaction term. So it's buried in residual.
Can you show me the equation again? The
Full.
composite one up at the top?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, so we're missing the third U that we had in the model. If that were in here, then this would have explained that U variance. But at some point, I'd had that in originally and things started to fall apart, so I took it out for the sake of demonstration. And yes, the answers that are in this example vary across SAS, Stata, and R, and that is always going to be the case. Like the more complex your model, the less like you will get the same answer out of multiple packages. One of the reasons why you're not having a homework on this unit, because I just give up at that point to trying to make everything work together.
So, like, not in homework though, but
Mhm.
when we're running our own studies in real life,
Yeah.
does that matter? Or, like, so long as you report what package you used, is that okay then?
At a minimum, you report the package you used and which version,
Yeah.
right? Was it Stata 17 or Stata 18? Because sometimes they change things in between versions. I think that if you get something that seems weird or unreliable, like standard errors of 20,000 or something, then checking it out in another package would be good due diligence. I have seen simulation studies where they've looked at differences across packages, and some of the differences I was like, that has to be a problem in R, because like they had degrees of freedom that exceeded the sample size. In one thing I read, it was like, that cannot happen, like logically speaking. So something had to have gone awry, in which case I would not trust, those results. But yeah, yet another reason to become, is there a term for knowing multiple program languages like multilingual?
Omnivore stats person.
Omnivore stats person, like you eat everything?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go with that. it's good to be an omnivore, you see, because then you are not tied to one particular package or one particular version of things, and you can check your results across packages, and you can collaborate with people who only know one package as well, right? There's a lot of faculty who learned to do something one way in graduate school, and they didn't, continue learning because they knew how to do what they needed, but they only know how to do something in one place. So you can swoop in, eat your plants, eat your meat, eat your fish, I don't know, eat your dairy.
There you go.
Yeah, all the things that you can eat. All right. Oh yeah, I know what else I was going to say. I was going to make this point again. So this effect size of about 8% of the variance is tied to this slope, which is not significant. Anything I should worry about in concluding that the null hypothesis looks to be true-ish? Not significant. Effect size is 8% of the variance. 8% would be something that would normally be significant, I think. Like just eyeballing it. What's the relevant sample size for this effect size? Yeah, 33 schools. That's why. So in terms of power, we have 1,000 kids. We have 50 primary schools, and we have 33 secondary schools. So the power to detect differences in secondary school intercepts as a function of secondary school characteristics is based on 33. It's not a lot. The power for children is not 1,000, because that does not take into account the effective sample size that the clustering creates. So you'd have to come up with a design effect based on a cross design, which I honestly don't know how to do. But I know it's not 1,000. That's what I know. Okay, did we talk about SES yet?
I don't think so.
Okay, if we did, it's gone from my memory, which means, functionally we did not. All right, so SES is my token child predictor. It is somehow a continuous variable on a scale of 1 to 6. Okay, sure. Mean was near 4, so that's what I subtracted, and I went ahead and added it. So the coefficient that it goes with is gamma 1O, because this is the first predictor in the C spot, the first child predictor. I'm leaving the other things in the model for now so that we can say we controlled for school denomination status. So adding this, here's what we get back. My effective SES looks to be significant. It is a coefficient of 0.11. So for every unit more SES your kid has, their achievement goes up by 0.1. But then the question, of course, what am I assuming in estimating this child SES slope all by itself?
No contextual effect.
No contextual effect? Singular?
Oh.
Oh, yeah, effects, plural. Yeah, shaking your head like, oh God, we're not gonna do this, are we? Yeah, we are. Yeah, we are. Because I know, there's two kinds of contexts, right? And there's the unique context, potentially, as well. So there's 3 contextual effects that I could potentially have to worry about. And if we look at the pseudo R-squares for this model, which of my 3 variance components should this have explained? Primary differences, secondary differences, or kid differences?
Kid difference.
Kid, level 1 residual. So we had basically no reduction in variance from the primary by secondary interaction. We're up to 4%, which is a net gain of about 4%. So it did explain 4% of the reasons why kids differ in achievement within the same type of school is because of their SES, but it also increased the pseudo R-square another 6% for the secondary schools. That's a smushed effect. The only way that a level 1 predictor can account for level 2 variance is by the hidden level 2 variance in the level 1 predictor. It's the Trojan horse. So if the level 1 predictor has secondary variance in it, then that has the potential for a separate effect that needs to be in the model as such. The primary, not so much, for whatever reason. So I went ahead and threw in 3 contextual effects at the same time, because why not? Why not, right? I already have like, 8 models in this handout. You gotta take some shortcuts somewhere. In practice, however, for those of you working on individual projects, I usually would prefer to just dump everything in at once, to not have the smushed model. Because then you know that nothing is misspecified and you can talk about within contextual and between all in one fell swoop. When I do it separately, it's usually for some kind of pedagogical purpose of recognizing what's happening. So I'm adding in the contextual effect of mean SES across the primary school, mean SES across the secondary school, and then the unique combination of the two. So 3 different kinds of contextual effects in this case. Survey says the previous student SES slope was 0.11-ish. It's now 0.089, so it's very close, but it was too high before because it looks like there is a positive bias being created by the contextual effect of the secondary. So after controlling for your own students' SES, if you go to a school that has if your primary school had richer kids in it, your score goes down, not significantly. If you go to a school where the secondary school where the kids are richer, your score goes up non-significantly. And if you went to a school that has both rich kids, then it goes up non-significantly too. So I'm not surprised that these are non-significant because there was very little SES variance at those levels to begin with. It was simulated not to have any. But this is what I would do if I had this problem in real data, which is why I'm showing it this way. And R is like, my okay level is 0. I do not like this model, but I'm not sure why. Because neither of the other packages had any problem with it. All the results seem okay. The variances are above 0, decidedly. So I don't know why it's mad. Stata and SAS were fine with this model. Future research should examine potential differences across programs in estimation algorithm and their deleterious effects on model recovery. How's that?
Does such research exist?
Yeah. It could. It very well could. I have not seen anything looking at it, but it doesn't mean that I'm looking in the right places. Because differences in algorithms would be like in stat journals, not the kind of journals that I read that have words in them. I'm serious. I could not read Psychometrica to save my life. I probably couldn't read Biometrica or Stat America. I don't know, like I'm making up journals at this point, but there are some that are not, there's not very many words because that's not the language that's spoken in that discipline. So, what about random effects? Is it possible that the effect of student SES varies across clusters?
Yeah,
Which one?
all of them.
Yeah, any of them. Let's try this one first. So this is a cluster mean centered predictor. So I'm centering it relative to the unique combination of primary and secondary. That way this is purely level 1 with respect to both types of clustering. And I am adding it across primary schools. So you don't normally see this because the composite notation, it looks a little bit different. Here is the level 1 effect of SES as a fixed effect. This is the random effect. So this is a hybrid model where the random effect is being applied to a different version of the predictor than the fixed effect would, but it still works out to be okay. So in terms of where it goes, in Stata, you would put the variable that you want the random slope for after the colon for the nesting that you want it across. So this is across primary schools. In R, the same is true by putting it inside the parentheses for the one that you want it to be random over. So we're asking whether the effect of being a richer kid than the other kids in your school varies across primary schools. This is an equity question, I think. And variance to 0 to like 4 decimal places. And a correlation with the intercept of 1. Both of those are bad. So this time R is like No, 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 no. And so was Stata and SAS. So correlation between random effects of one means that your model is over-parameterized, has too much stuff in it. You don't need both. A variance that is basically zero means there's no differences here to be found. Either way, that indicates that you probably shouldn't keep this solution. Likelihood ratio test being non-significant definitely adds to that conclusion. And I computed a slope reliability of 0.002 for that. So yeah, not so good. Here is the confidence interval using that barely zero variance. So the slope ranges from 0.07 to 0.11 across schools, according to this model. So not really much variation to keep track of. But then I have a thought question here. What if this variance would have been significant and sizable? What kind of predictors would we have used to explain it? If the effect of being a relatively richer kid varied across primary schools, what kind of fixed effects would explain that?
Primary school characteristics?
Primary school as main effects,
Yeah. Well, cross-level interaction,
cross-level interactions, but with what?
level 1 predictors.
Yeah, it has to be an interaction with this variable within school SES because that is the variable the random slope is for. And because it's varying over primary schools, it would have to be a primary school characteristic. So like primary school denomination by this term would have explained this variance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Maybe? I don't know if the equation will help on that score, but this is a primary school thing now. But it can only explain a slope variance if it interacts with the predictor that it's the slope for. What if we put in that same interaction and this slope was not here? Then what does it explain instead?
Residual variance,
It's always residual.
systematically varying effect.
Yep, it'd be systematically varying. So if you put in a cross-level interaction and the level 1 predictor that's attached to it is not random, it explains residual. Because then there'd be no u in that equation for it to explain. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Maybe? Maybe? Zoomers? Thumbs? Okay, it's going well. What if I added a random slope over the other dimension instead? Could I do that? I just did. Here's random slope over secondary schools instead. And I did that by reversing in Stata which one got the weird prefix so that I could put the random slope here. I tried and failed to get a random slope to work inside that notation. I don't think it can. So I think functionally what that means, Stata users, is that within this mixed framework, you cannot have random slopes across both cross dimensions at the same time. I don't see how it's possible. You could if you switch the way you're approaching the model, though. So Stata has a GSEM package that is generalized structural equation modeling that you can hack into multi-level modeling. There's also a package, it's like GLLAMM. It's called GLAM. I don't know what it stands for, but I think it's Skrondel and Rabahetskas package. And that is another kind of generalized SEM thing. So I think that's where you would need to go if you needed to have random slopes over both dimensions at the same time. In R, though, and in SAS and in Stata mixed, by the way, it doesn't care. You could have them in both of these sets of parentheses at the same time, and it's fine. This particular data set doesn't support it, though. We get the same result. The random slope variance is 0 to several decimal places with the correlation of 1 with the intercept. And note that it's the intercept of secondary. It's the correlation with whichever dimension you're in for the random at level 2. And then same question. If this random slope variance needed to be in the model, what would explain it this time? Last time it was primary school characteristics in a cross-level interaction with that variable. This time, secondary in a cross-level interaction with that variable. Yes, that's what it would be, and if it's not in the model, residual variance. There, words. See? All done. We got there. Exciting. Words, words, words. No pictures today because there's like no significant results to talk about. But he made the data. It's not my fault. All right. Any questions on this example before I shut it down? All right. Bye-bye. Back to lecture 5. So we did some general concept-y stuff. I want to just spend a few minutes on time-varying clusters. We haven't talked about time in this class. If you'd like to learn about longitudinal models, come back next fall, in which that class will be offered. And for those of you in this class, and if you're going to ask me, is that really different? Yes. Time is a beast. So modeling change over time and correlations over time, it's a whole thing. That's the entire semester, and we have talked about none of that in this class. So yes, it is the same thing from the perspective of time is level 1 and people are level 2, and all the same concepts you've learned have applied, but just modeling the dependency over time is a lot more complex. It can take on a lot more forms than just intercept or slope. So that's what the rest of that time goes into. We also spend a good deal of time on nonlinear slopes, because a straight line doesn't work for change over time in most settings, so different kinds of nonlinear. And that takes the entire semester. I don't even get to time-varying predictors. But then if I'm able to, the next semester after that, I guess, was that 25? God, yeah.
Yes, yep.
Spring 25, I might be able to bring the advanced class back that covers time-varying predictors and multi-level, which then turns into SEM to do it properly. So that's a whole thing. So yes, come back in the fall if you'd like to learn more about time. But for now, excellent class. Oh, thank you. Not because I'm grading you or anything, right? I have. I'm just saying. I'm just saying when I get compliments in class, I'm well aware of the power differential that is at play here. Like, I really love your classes. Can I have a letter of recommendation? That kind of thing. I'm glad. I like teaching them, so I'm glad that folks at least want to come, even if it's a little bit painful in the moment. I'm okay with you hating me right now, because eventually I hope that it makes your life better, and you have skills that you can take with you. But, so time-varying clusters. I had never thought about this, really, until I had students doing projects, and someone had clustered longitudinal data, and they're like, which cluster should I use? Well, what do you mean? Well, in kindergarten, they were in one classroom, and then they went to first grade, and that's a different classroom, and then they went to second grade, and that's a different classroom. So which clustering should I use? Oh, crap. The first one? Like, I don't know what to do with this. So this makes things exponentially more complicated when you have clustering that can change over time, not just in terms of the membership, but also the extent of it as well. So in the second part of chapter 11 in my longitudinal textbook, I have an example with a time-varying classroom effect. So I wanted to spend, I think, probably the rest of this class, not more than that, on talking about this. And we'll start Logits next time. Does that seem fair? Logits on fresh on a Thursday? Yeah.
So, in my world then, like, so students moving to different classes, what if over their time in clinic, the patient is working with a different clinician?
Mm-hmm.
Is that one of these
Yep.
things too?
It could be.
Okay.
So if they're being seen by a different provider, or like if there's like a group therapy and they move which group they're in, yep, that's absolutely relevant here. And if you have different providers within locations, then that's another layer of nesting or crossing that you'd have to address as well. Yeah, these things can get ugly real quick in real data.
Just think, 5-year plan for the data
Yeah,
analysis.
5-year plan. Yes, indeed. So in a relatively straightforward example, let's say that students are nested in a different class at each occasion. That's a common type of design. So what we're talking about is a time-varying classroom effect. In this case, we would have occasions at level 1 nested in students. That's the longitudinal part. But we also have occasions nested in clusters and students in clusters are crossed at level 2. That's how I would think about that. So it's not a 3-level design, it's 2-level crossed instead. This, by the way, these types of models are the basis of what are known as value-added models, which I think have fallen out of favor, but if not, they should. This is where you measure teachers and students repeatedly, and then you estimate random effects for teachers to describe how well they do. Yep, we're shaking your heads. Nope. Nope. Until students get randomly assigned to classrooms, I don't want to hear it. Because better teachers often get assigned to classes that need more help, or teachers who want to make a difference choose those things. There's all kinds of reasons why teachers might look differently effective based on only the judgment of how well their students do, not to mention the fact that these assessments are often based on measuring proficiency and not skill. Like they're not ceilinged up to measure continued growth. So if you have kids who are already at the top, they're already proficient, you can't measure their growth anymore. It looks like you're failing because they're not growing, but they're already at the top. So there's all kinds of issues with that extension of this model, that is the underlying machinery that runs these things. So there's at least two. Here's our sort of 2 ideas, let's put it that way. There's a million others of how you could address the idea of clustering. And one is from the perspective that clustering only matters when you're there, and that's it. So I call that an acute effect. The example that I have in chapter 11 is very much in this line. And the analysis that I had in that was teacher-rated aggression of the individual students, where it was the teacher filling out the survey for all of their students. Again, not ideal, but do you think that if you answer the same questions about all your students, there might be something correlated about those answers beyond just the classroom, right? It's your opinion, especially for something about aggression, which is somewhat subjective. Like, I have no idea how normal my kid is, because I only see my kid, and I know his rhythms and his personality, but I couldn't tell you if he's aggressive without having a reference group to compare him to. And if your class is a different kind of reference group than someone else's class, then I imagine that your ratings would be very different for that. So for something like this, if the teacher is the one rating the outcome about their students, it would make sense that whatever clustering effect is created would go away when the teacher's not doing the rating anymore. Like it's just a one-time thing. A transfer effect, though, would make more sense for like an academic outcome, where maybe if you have an awesome kindergarten teacher, you learn to read better than other classes, and that benefit stays with you, because once you get done learning to read, you read to learn. So from that perspective, the clustering from where you used to be should still be relevant to where you are now. So then how do you put those ideas into a model? Well, here's one way. So we're familiar with the idea of a random intercept, right? Right? Mean differences. If I were to represent an intercept as a variable in my data set, what would it look like? Like if you see the matrix representation of regression, there's a column in the X design matrix for the intercept. What's in that column? Ones, right? That's the intercept. And if I took out the automatic intercept generated by software and I put that column in, that's what I would get. It would become the fixed intercept. Well, what if we could customize that column? What if we could take the zeros and ones and selectively turn them on or off or up or down to recognize how much clustering should be happening to that kid in that year? We can do that. So that's what I'm trying to do in this table by 2 different coding schemes. So let's look at the bottom of the table first, student ID 102. They were in class number 3 the first year, class 21 the second year, and class 42 the last year. So the first thing I had to do is take that long information, transpose it to wide, so that every year I know where they were at all 3 occasions. That's going to go in the model. And then if I want to represent the effect of their clustering as an acute effect, then I would put a 1 in a custom intercept column that's going to become the year 0 intercept for when they're in that class and not otherwise. So that's why I have the diagonal here. Over here, on the last set of columns, this would look if I wanted to see if the transfer was happening. So then where they were in year 0 contributes to their year 0 outcome. It also contributes to the year 1 and their year 2. So the clustering stays with them. And this is an assumption by using just ones that it's the same effective cluster whether I'm talking about when they were there or when they're in the future. This could also be a decay function, for instance. Maybe it's 1 and then it cuts in half and then it cuts in half and then it cuts in half or something like that. We could put in numbers that would operationalize the idea of a decay in the clustering. And we could compare different versions of these numbers across models via AIC and BIC. And that could help us decide what kind of evidence there is for acute versus transfer, and then what kinds of transfers. The first student is an example of what would happen if you have missing data. So this person was not in the data set for year 1, so I gave them a missing data code for their class ID. Okay, so class number 2. Now, minus 99 is not a person, and I don't want to lump together all the minus 99s. So in that person's coding scheme, if we don't know what class they were in, they get a 0. We don't want to turn on their intercept to have something in common. So we make that 0 on purpose, and otherwise would make it look like a transfer effect. So the coding to this can be a little bit tricky, but the idea is that you're building custom intercepts that turn up or down or on or off as a function of when you want that classroom effect to be present in that child's life in that year. That's the key idea. Then you have a question as to whether you want to make it a fixed effect or a random effect. The top model here is fixed effects. So in my notation, I have a piecewise model for whether it's year 0 versus 1 and 1 versus 2. And then all of these gammas here in the next 3 rows, this is from treating classroom ID as a categorical predictor and letting it interact with the year that they're in that classroom. So this is like the effect of being in classroom 1 at year 0, classroom 2 at year 0, all the way up to the last classroom. So these are like dummy coded if you treat it as a factor variable. Then I do the same thing for year 1, and then I do the same thing for year 2. So these are year-specific fixed effects that control for what classroom you were in. This is what you would do if you absolutely don't want a cross-model and you just want the classroom dependency to go away. That's what this does. Because you're fixed effecting it out. You're controlling for it so that whatever's left is just student information. You're doing it with fixed effects instead of random. The same thing can happen, by the way, for those of you who have cluster data where there's not that many clusters. Like if I only had 5 classrooms, how well do you think it's going to go to estimate a random variance across 5 things? It's not going to go well. It's just not. It's not going to go well at all up until like 15, 20, but then the literature says maybe like 50, 100 is really where you start to see something that resembles truth. So if you only have 5, do you get to ignore it? Well, that's not cool either. This is what you can do instead. Put in classroom ID as a fixed effect, as a factor variable. Control for classroom mean differences by treating it as a categorical predictor in your model. That controls for intercept differences. If you wanted to control for slope differences, that would be an interaction of the categorical classroom predictor with that variable. So you don't have to always use random effects for clustering. You can use fixed effects if you really don't want to care about it or if there's not very many. Alternatively, the bottom model is treating classrooms as a random effect, which would allow you to predict classroom differences at year 0, at year 1, and year 2 as 3 separate random intercepts. And in my case, I was able to put them on 3 different random statements because it was different classrooms in each year, so I didn't have to worry about them being correlated. If they're correlated, that's another ball of wax. Okay. Yeah. I have some stuff about software. What did I say here? Oh, this is the thing about Stata. That's what I tried to estimate. Yeah, so here's a link to the stuff I sent you for Dawn. He's the one who explained this to me in a way that I could finally understand it. And I will note that those of you who want to try this in M+, if you want to have latent variables as part of your story, in addition to cross-classified random effects, you can, but it has to be done using Bayesian estimation. They don't have an ML version. So, there. We did it. That's all I wanted to say about that. I guess it's not. That's all I have slides about. But I have one more thing I thought about saying. If you have longitudinal data in which students are in the same school the whole time, is it really the same school?
No,
Eh.
because like the person's changing over time.
Yeah, like
right?
what is the
And
school?
like grades are going in and out.
Yeah, like even if it's literally the same school, is it the same teacher? Is it the same cohort of children? Like my child sits at a little, they have like 5 desks in a little pile in his room, and there's like 4 or 5 of these little piles. And he interacts a lot more with the kids in his little pile than he does the rest of the kids. Well, what if the teacher moves desks around so the kids get to know each other? Is that the same clustering? Yeah. So there are models in which you can actually see whether the school effect is the same at each occasion or whether it changes over time. If you think about it from an ICC perspective, does it make sense that the extent to which kids from the same school are correlated is the same at kindergarten as it is at 10th grade? Probably not. At the very least, that's an empirical question. So clustering can change over time even if it's not because they moved. Kate says, like one school I work with had 85% turnover within 1 year. That's probably not the same school. Yeah. So there's a lot of complexity when you really dive into like what does clustering mean and how does it translate into differences for children that are persistent over time or not persistent. So it's a whole thing. Lots of dissertation ideas in here for folks who are interested in this problem.
That is interesting.
Yeah, it's not the same.
So you could probably substitute the word school for clinic.
Yeah, I used to work in a department, right? And it's like, is my department a functional department in this year with this chair? Or is it a different department after someone else takes over? Or we have new faculty who come and certain faculty retire, right? Is it the same department every year? I don't know about that.
I mean, in some disciplines, it is the same people who stay there forever.
It can be, but the cluster is a dynamic entity, I think, is that's the take-home message. And thinking about it that way can yield some interesting insights. Okay, comments or questions? Okay, then I'm really done, I promise. I want to make sure everyone can get their costumes on and go trick-or-treating tonight.
What is young Huey?
Young Huey is Snorlax, the Pokemon.
Pokemon, yeah.
So it's basically a giant set of pajamas with like a cartoon hood. So he should be relatively warm. Yeah, it's going to be the world's shittiest night trick-or-treating, like 20-mile-an-hour winds. No snow, though. So there's that. Yeah, he's 8, and we're going to do it, but God, I just want to buy him a thing of Kit Kats and sit home. I really do. Like, I have the money, kid. I will buy you 3 bags of Kit Kats. Like, you don't need to work this hard. But,
It's
no.
the memories.
It is the memories. I'm going to cherish these memories for as long as I have the frostbite that gave them to me. So, there, ending early on Halloween. Enjoy your holiday, however you do it. And send me pictures if you do anything interesting. Thanks, folks. See you Thursday.
It's a method